this is a huge, I guess, document, and one that the council has seen many times before. In fact, I'll preface my comments by saying that you've seen it enough times that I intend on just giving you a brief overview. Don will back me up on the main presentation, and then Les will give about a 5 to 8 minute discussion of infrastructure.
8 being the high side.
Exactly.
8. I was thinking seconds.
Okay, so we'll go through this, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Don's here to
You put time limits on Les and not on Don?
Don will respond to questions, so that's his role tonight. Okay, so the outline of the discussion essentially is just what you see up here. I'm not going to read every slide, obviously, but there were 3 parts to this: sanitation, water, and sewer. Water and sewer, as you know, were the subject of a 2005-2006 rate study, our first rate study, and we'll go through the very basics of that, the reasoning behind having a rate study as we swing into the second water and sewer rate study, which is what you have before you, and our initial sanitation rate study. As you'll see on the slide, the sanitation mission and study results are a little bit different because we had just revamped our sanitation system. We did a strategic plan, and we also, throughout the study, you'll see some differences because as we went through the strategic plan and the actual rate study, the council had not moved ahead, or staff had not moved ahead. We'd not come together on the roll cart proposal, which is what we have today. So there will be a slide toward the back where we'll have to explain a little bit. Okay, so I have no idea why that's blank. Oh, that's why. Okay, so the sanitation mission, these animations are something that, kind of like your understanding of fiber, I'm not quite used to. But the first thing was to try and come up with a multi-year study so that we could meet the financial needs of sanitation, which we had never done before. The council also, in adopting the strategic plan on Valentine's Day of 2011, we put forth goals, and the council approved that strategic plan, so that took us into the rate study. Okay, the idea was to establish equity and balance among both the services provided and customer classes. As you know, we have mechanical containers, we had different levels of residential cans and those sorts of things, as well as services provided, recycling, those sorts of things, and the services provided by the transfer facility outside of town. And lastly, there had to be some sort of cost recovery system so that customers' needs were proportional, or their services were proportional to the customer demands. So, going through that very quickly, this is just a recount of what the rate study did, or excuse me, the rate committee, and those folks are familiar to you. They've attended meetings, you've attended workshops both for sanitation and water and sewer, and this is the work that they did. And on March 5th of 2012, that is a wrong date, council approved the sanitation rate study. So these are the adopted sanitation rates per the rate study that you have in this document here, and I want to thank staff for who did the work to put this together. But this comprehensive rate study document is one that not only will we use for the next 5 years, but will be utilized as we revisit this process in about 4 years. So as you can see, let me make sure I do this right. Is there a pointer? Yeah, it's awfully weak. Okay, Walter, could I borrow your...
You like mine?
I do. It's a little brighter than what I've got. Thank you, sir.
If you don't cover what I want to ask, bring it back to me, please.
Okay.
Okay.
So what you have here is the rates that were to be established in 2013, because of course this was passed in approved in 2012, the strategic plan and the rate study. So it goes through 2020. You'll see all of these go through 2020. As I indicated, and we'll go to the next slide, and maybe that'll answer your question.
If I may.
Okay.
I have heard comments from the public since we went to the to the roll carts about increased garbage rates. And I just wanted to point out what I think the situation is and remind people where we were. And Tim Davis in the back, or Don, can correct me when I go wrong, or Gary for that matter. We were at, and I'm speaking of one garbage can, we were at $18.50 prior to the rate study. And once the rate study went in, we lowered it to $16.75. And we were on that while Public Works Finance was standing on Tim's neck saying, when are you going to get carts on the ground? And once we got carts on the ground, we went back up by 90 cents. So we have yet to get back up to what people were paying prior to adopting the rate study.
That is true, and I think the next slide will assist with that. Again, this was the rate study as proposed when we were still with cans.
And I'm not suggesting that garbage is cheap or free. I'm just
Sure.
saying that the rates have moved around, and to some degree in a less onerous fashion than people may feel.
And looked like Tom had a question on this
Well,
slide.
I just wanted to
too.
add to that, I think that what people are also seeing on their billing card is they're seeing also a water and a sewer rate increases as well, and they're,
Yes.
they're seeing a grand total perhaps increase, and I think that's part of the reaction.
Yeah, we'll explain the need for those and as we move along. The next slide, of course, once roll carts were put on the ground, these are the rates. And if you go back to the previous slide, you'll see that $17.95 was the one can rate. And here you've got a 35-gallon can at $17.65. So again, it's one of those things that just because of the way it came together, there was a small savings. Also, one of the things the council asked for is the on-demand option, which is what you see on the bottom. So provide some savings to those folks who don't utilize can per week service. Okay, so that explains. If there's any questions about sanitation, be happy to answer those, but I would like to go through the entire presentation, and it might get some of your questions answered. But that's essentially sanitation. Sanitation now, as Walter indicated, the rates were actually put in place over a year ago, and then they were adjusted when the roll carts got put on the ground. Okay, water and sewer process is quite a bit more complex. There are two pieces to it. Of course, over here you've got your water. Over here you have your sanitation. And these are the things that are looked at. What are our fiscal policies? What are the revenue requirements? Cost allocations, customer cost allocations, and finally design of rates. So again, in my promise to keep this somewhat brief, as you've seen it before, there was a financial plan that we based on our 2013-14 budget as a base. That would be FY 2013, or excuse me, 14. There are escalation factors, and one of the reasons we do the rate study is to look at those and determine, okay, how do we know what costs are going to be into the future? Well, there's no way to really do that without doing some prognostication, and that's why we hired FCS engineers or consultants out of Seattle to help us with that. And they looked at all the factors, history, so on and so forth, and looked at what we could expect based on history and the current state of the economy, what we'd see for escalation factors. So you get some that are pretty, 3% seems to be where salaries are adjusted per year. Benefits, as you know, have been very volatile. We don't know how national health care will affect those, but those are some of the factors taking in. Then the fund balance targets are things that the council looked at and passed a resolution of our fiscal policy, and that is that our operating fund for utilities has 90 days of operating expenses in reserve, so to speak. So we always have 90 days of operating expenses that we try to keep in the bank. And then capital fund of 1% of the plant asset value. Okay, the rate committee again, just going through, and this was for water and sewer. So this was were the times that they met. A lot of work was done in between, even more so than in the sanitation rate study. FCS, Les's folks, Don's folks, all met many times to talk about cost allocations and those sorts of things before it was finally brought into the council. And we had a workshop, as you recall. The rate study committee was there, and it was determined by the council that we would move ahead and establish these rates in the FY14 budget, which was passed effective October 1st of 2014. But the preparation and the numbers, the rates, were actually discussed in June and July.
And Gary, could you just highlight kind of the complexion of the composition of the rate committee? Just sort of the representation.
Certainly. There was a council representative on there, at least one. We had folks from the business communities. We had restaurant owners. We had multifamily housing owners. We had residential. We had 2 or 3 members of the public at large. Am I missing anybody? We tried to represent especially...
Cemetery.
Excuse me? Oh, cemetery. Exactly. And as you talk about sewer rates, you've got different classes of folks. Commercial water, as you just indicated, the cemetery uses a large amount of water, the cost of which had not been recaptured, and was something that we had to deal with because of the volumes that were being used. So we tried to get a good cross-section of representation, just as we did with sanitation as well. Okay, so let's swing into water. Okay. Capital funding sources. How do we fund capital? We do it with our cash balance. Rate funding, we're able to put away anywhere between $150,000 and $400,000 per year, depending on maintenance, operations, those sorts of things. And then connection charges for hooking up to the city system, $98,000 to $175,000 a year, of course, depending on building in the city. Okay, the debt issues for water capital are, as you can see, significant. $12.9 million was assumed in this rate study. This is, if you look through here, you can see how that all adds up. These are capital improvements that Les will talk about a little bit in his presentation, but these were things that have been identified in our water and sewer comp plans that are necessary to keep providing the service and capacity for our citizens. Currently, and we're fairly proud of this, but as you can see, we're going to have to do some capital. There are no debt obligations in the water utility. In other words, there are no revenue bonds outstanding in the water utility. As you know, as the council knows, we are in the process of, and I think at our next Public Works Finance Committee meeting, we will be talking about judicial confirmation for well number 10 and attendant services to well number 10, as well as for the northwest tank replacement. So if we have done a good job, hopefully the court will approve those, give judicial confirmation for that, and we can move ahead with these necessary capital projects. Okay, this is just a good illustration of where we are going. If you look at 2014 and the debt that we expect to incur at this time, and then you'll see there's a slight increase with the average, but the different colors here talk about what we need to operate the utility, transfers, those sorts of things. But if you look at new debt service, which is the yellow here, this represents the increased capital that we cannot fund with the current rates. So these rates are increasing, and one of the reasons they're increasing is not only to cover the operations and maintenance, but also to cover those new capital expenditures or obligations. Okay, we have 2 different class definitions, residential, and as you look, single, duplex, and triplex. These all are, except for some older buildings and some that were built under previous building codes or policies, each of these are represented by a meter per unit. And then you have, call it non-residential, it's commercial. Multifamily, obviously multifamily is residential, but you have 1 meter serving several units, and typically what you see there is those bills are going to a management company or the owner of the multifamily. One of the things that Don would skewer me if I didn't mention, we still have issues with landlord-tenant, and the council will be asked to provide some guidance on that in the future. What I'm talking about, of course, is who should be responsible for a utility bill for a residence that is not owned by or occupied by the owner. And we have some information that we'll bring to the council. And then, of course, you've got your commercial, which covers all of the businesses in town.